Today on Straight Talk Africa, governments and the international community are fighting Boko Haram in Nigeria and Al-Shabaab in Somalia. But who is really winning this war on terrorism? That's coming up next in our discussion right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa. It's Wednesday, December 10th. I am Shaka Ssali.
And hello to all our viewers and listeners on the continent and elsewhere. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Mariama Diallo, your social media reporter.
Today, we'll discuss the war on terror and the ongoing battles against the major terrorist groups in Africa.
And coming up later in our STA inbox, we'll share some of your thoughts on this topic. You can also be part of this conversation during the live program by tweeting or posting on our Facebook page. Hope you'll stay with us.
But first, combating terrorist groups in Africa, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and others, so far, despite African and international efforts, deadly attacks appear to be increasing and spreading across borders. My colleague Paul Cisco has more, but note that there are some disturbing scenes in this report.
November 28th, more than 100 people are killed when multiple explosions rip through the central mosque in Kano, northeastern Nigeria. On November 25th, at least 38 are killed when two female suicide bombers attack a crowded market in another northeastern city. Before that, 60 more women reportedly kidnapped at the hands of the militant group Boko Haram. Meanwhile, more than 200 Chibok schoolgirls kidnapped last spring are still missing. Deadly violence continues unabated, is becoming a frequent refrain from West Africa, where a 5-year insurgency by Boko Haram has left more than 10,000 people dead. The group's power base is in northeast Nigeria, where the pace and deadliness of attacks have increased most since Nigeria's military chief announced a ceasefire on October 17th that never happened. Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan wants to extend the state of emergency in Borno, Yobe, and Adamawa states that expired on November 20th.
We must not allow our countries to become safe havens for terrorists. We must cooperate maximally in better managing our political boundaries. We should adopt protocols that allow countries to pursue terrorists well into their safe havens in other nations. While we cannot redefine our borders, we must redefine our collective approach to ending transboundary terrorism and insurgencies.
Nearby, Boko Haram is reportedly recruiting young Cameroonians, prompting lawmakers there to boost its defense and security forces. And a newly drafted law, if signed by President Paul Biya, will make terrorism punishable by death. In East Africa, another regular refrain. Somalia's Al-Shabaab insurgents have claimed responsibility for the attack. Somalia-based Al-Shabaab militants affiliated with al-Qaeda carry out frequent terrorist attacks in and around the Somali capital Mogadishu. Just over a week ago, on December 2nd, a United Nations convoy was attacked, killing 3, wounding many more. On November 25th, Al-Shabaab militants killed 36 workers in Kenya's Mandera County. Al-Shabaab insurgents also claimed responsibility for a November 22nd attack when 28 people were killed when their Nairobi bus was ambushed. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta says terrorism is a very serious matter.
We are in a war against terrorists in and outside our country. With the aid of sympathizers, supporters, and collaborators among our communities, terrorists have retaliated viciously to deter us from our determined, effective, and successful effort to rid the Horn of Africa of terrorism and violent extremism.
Al-Shabaab began attacking Kenyan civilians when Nairobi sent its troops into Somalia in 2011. Since then, Kenyan forces have targeted Al-Shabaab hideouts across Somalia, prompting further attacks from the terrorists. On September 13, 2013, Al-Shabaab fighters killed 68 civilians in a Nairobi shopping mall. Now, there are fresh reports that the militant group is transporting more men and equipment to the southern regions of Somalia, bordering Kenya. Paul Cisco, VOA News.
Thanks, Paul, for that report. Now joining us here in our Washington studios are two distinguished guests. Laura Adele Oso, co-founder of Act for Accountability, a Nigerian-American advocacy group based here in Washington, D.C. Since April, her organization rallied 300 people outside the Embassy of Nigeria to pressure idle government officials to take measurable actions to save 276 schoolgirls kidnapped by Boko Haram militants in the northern eastern Nigerian village of Chibok. Well, Laura, I have to say frankly that I'm profoundly honored.
Thank you for having
And
me.
exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you for the first time, mind you,
Yes.
on Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
You're most welcome. And retired U.S. Army Colonel, but certainly not tired, Thomas Dempsey, who currently serves as the Africa Center for Strategic Studies Chair for Security Studies. Professor Dempsey specializes in security sector reform, rule of law, post-conflict transitions, and peace operations. I have to say, frankly, Tom, that as I said a little bit earlier, we share more than one, at least in our life.
We do, and it's a real privilege to be here. I have enjoyed watching your show tremendously and realize what an impact you have with your audience in Africa.
I mean, I can't believe that we are two here from the Bruins of Westwood.
Yes, indeed.
And of course, also having some military background.
Fellow paratroopers, yes.
It's always a pleasure to have you on the show, Tom.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Later in the program, we'll give you, the audience, a chance to call and talk with our guests. The number to call is 202-619-3111. US country code is 1. Let me come to you immediately, Laura. What is the latest?
Well, actually, as of today, there was another attack by Boko Haram in Kano. As your piece indicated, there was one that happened November 26, where 120 people were killed at a mosque. And so today, the estimates are 4 people have been killed and dozens very injured.
Some time back, of course, you remember that we were told by Abuja
Yes.
that Abuja had clinched a deal with Boko Haram, and we were in fact on the verge of seeing the girls being released. What happened?
Well, not too long after that report was released, there was a video by Mohammed, by Abubakar, that says that you know, there actually hasn't been any such deal being brokered, and that the person that they claim was Boko Haram who was facilitating this deal is actually not Boko Haram. So we are not sure exactly if there really were any conversations about a deal and a promise to release the girls, but all indications show that the girls are still missing. Boko Haram is still being empowered by their acts, and they are not met with any resistance, any real resistance.
Very interesting. Tom, when you look at the Nigerian security forces, they are certainly some of the better trained on the continent.
Well, that's certainly true of their military. But I think one of the challenges here is that the activities of Boko Haram, it seems to me, are a symptom of broader problems in the security sector and in governance in general that aren't necessarily related to the military. I think the security in this sense is really at the community level, and that's the police and the local justice system. The Nigerians themselves have been aware of deep problems in those areas for a long time. I think one of the consequences we're seeing is a consequence of a failure to adequately address those problems.
From what I have read, it would appear as if there is a disconnect between authorities and the local ordinary people. Is that the same thing that you are seeing too?
Well, I would defer to my colleague on this, but I would say certainly for most people, and this is true throughout Africa, it's true here in the United States, our experience with state security is typically a function of the police, the justice system in our local communities, not the army. And so one of the challenges here is when you have a security vacuum because the police, for whatever reason, aren't able to function effectively, they lack legitimacy, they don't have a good relationship with the communities that they're policing, you create opportunities for other groups, non-state actors, Boko Haram, criminals, other violent groups, to step into that vacuum. and you reduce the sense of security at the community level that is really the basis for collaboration with the state to help confront common problems like Boko Haram.
Rola?
And I would really say that there is a big disconnect. It's not just a disconnect within the security forces and then the local police. That is very true. They don't agree a lot. I think the local police are outnumbered and outgunned, so to use that term. And unfortunately, this National Security Services, which seems to have more resources, also seems to be some of the people that we are hearing are committing human rights abuses. But then at the same time, there is a huge disconnect between the issue of poor governance and the issue of poor governance of the armed forces. And when you have a situation where, you know, the leadership of the country and then the leadership of your security services or armed forces that are supposed to protect the citizens cannot, it's really fractured and broken, then yes, this is the breeding ground for insurgencies such as Boko Haram or possibly what's going on in Somalia and you know, by proxy in Kenya. That's what happens. But furthermore, it's because there is not enough that the government has done in taking care of its people. An organization like Boko Haram exists because the northern elite and people who were in the government from 1999 did not take care of their people. When people, the role of a government is to protect its citizens, but also to make sure that the health and well-being of every single citizen is taken care of.
Provide service delivery.
Service delivery, education, access to education, economic development, human security, opportunities for trade. When those things are missing, it's a fertile ground for any kind of opposition that is offering people or is based on fear. Because Boko Haram is thriving because people are afraid. People are joining Boko Haram because, you know what, they seem to be able to protect their own people more than the local police are able to protect the people of the region. And for self-preservation, a lot of the boys, a lot of the men that are joining either in Cameroon or in Nigeria, it's because, I think a lot of it is because of that. It's because they see that this is a better opportunity for them to stay alive.
Does Boko Haram have the means, for example, to deliver any services to the people?
You know, I was reading a piece, I was listening to a piece a few days ago that was done by BBC, and, you know, it's not necessarily true. They don't necessarily have the means to provide services for their people, and at the same time, the issue of fear as modus operandi to control people and to keep them in line is what they're using. You know, Boko Haram is not interested in international countries. Their goal and their aim is the Nigerian government. It's to try to fracture Nigeria as we know it, and also to destabilize that region so that they can, you know, they can have territory that they, you know, currently have claimed Borno as a caliphate, so an Islamic state. So these are some of the issues that until we are honest enough to talk about them openly, where we have leadership and also we have a place where citizens can really voice their concern and be part of change of governance, this is it's just going to keep growing and growing and growing.
Tom, what is it that the Nigerian federal government, for example, needs to be doing to motivate its troops that it is not doing at the moment?
Well, obviously, this is a tremendous challenge for the Nigerian military. I mean, we're talking about a very remote area where operations are extraordinarily difficult and demanding. We're talking about a Nigerian military sector that's been having trouble sustaining forces. We've seen scandals about payment of salaries. But having said that, I think the biggest challenge that a young military commander in the Nigerian army faces is the lack of effective partners, the lack of effective local governance that has empowered local communities, the lack of effective delivery of governance services, the lack of effective and legitimate police forces and justice processes. When you send a military commander and a military unit into an environment where all those other players are absent or not effective or lacking in legitimacy, you're asking them to do something that the military is not designed to do.
We'll come back later to that. Now we'll pause for a short break. We would like to remind you that Straight Talk Africa is now on the social networking website Twitter, and we are tweeting live. Follow us at VOA Shaka. That's VOA Shaka, and join in on today's discussion with your questions and comments. Don't forget to use the hashtag, and we are still on Facebook. Just enter the keyword Straight Talk Africa, become a fan, and connect with other friends of the Voice of America. We will be right back with you, so please don't go away.
Al-Shabaab means the youth or the youngsters. Al-Shabaab wants to avenge the Kenyan military presence in Somalia after Kenya sent troops into their country in October 2011 to secure its eastern border against the group. Al-Shabaab became linked with Al-Qaeda in 2012 when the Somali militants lost control of Mogadishu to African Union troops. Al-Shabaab carried out the attack on Nairobi's Westgate Mall in September 2013, killing 68 people.
Sia Nyama Koroma, the First Lady of Sierra Leone, speaks to VOA on the Ebola crisis.
I would want the people in West Africa to know that Ebola is real. Ebola kills. Early detection and prompt treatment can save lives. And I'm asking our people not to victimize or stigmatize survivors. Ebola is a challenge, but together we'll all be able to overcome it.
That was Sia Nyama Koroma, the First Lady of Sierra Leone, speaking to VOA Africa on the Ebola crisis.
This is Straight Talk Africa on the Voice of America. What is your opinion about today's topic? Call us at 202-619-3111. U.S. country code 1. When you call, remember the following. Ask only one question, keep your comment brief, and turn down the volume on your radio or television. Now let's return to Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Githui. I'm sorry, really, Tom, because I had the dubious privilege to interject because there is no democracy in Studio 52. If the producer says go for a break, you have to go. So I hope you'll find some space in your beautiful heart. Forgive me for that.
Of course.
Pick up from where you left, please. We're asking you about the role of the Nigerian army. I mean, how come the Nigerian army is not doing what is expected of it really as a credible institution? I mean, there have been some reports, for example, that they are so demoralized. They absolutely have no motivation. In fact, others have even suggested that the security forces have been infiltrated by Boko Haram.
Well, first of all, let me say that I've worked with the Nigerian military in the field. They have, in my experience, some fine soldiers, some superb officers and NCOs. That said, they're facing extraordinary challenges, operational challenges in deploying and operating in the areas of northern Nigeria where the threat is most prevalent. This is an area that would be extraordinarily challenging to any army. Mm-hmm. They're grappling with institutional problems, and I think we're all aware of those. You've detailed them, some of them yourself. There are clearly some problems with corruption and governance within the Nigerian military. I think they're certainly aware of that. They're trying to address them. I think one of the questions is whether they will have the time to, whether the Boko Haram set of problems will give them the time to address those issues. But I would hasten to add, they are only one element in this. And the most critical lack for the Nigerian military is credible partners in the Nigerian government, effective local governance. And I think my colleague can talk about this, and I hope you will. Effective local police that have good relationships with the community, that can function effectively, that are trusted. Effective local justice systems. If you don't have a justice system if you have a justice system where people disappear into the justice system, they're never tried, they're never charged, that creates problems that the military is not designed to address. And then finally, there's the whole issue of development, which we haven't really talked about up to this point. One of the reasons these young people, who are not, most of them, inherently evil, so why are they joining Boko Haram? They have no jobs, they have no opportunity, they feel alienated and disconnected from their communities. They're young men who don't feel that they can marry because they don't have the wealth that's expected of a young man entering adulthood. These are the reasons they're turning, one of the reasons they're turning to Boko Haram. You have a similar situation in Somalia. We have to collectively address those issues. We have to offer alternatives for those young people.
Very interesting, Rhoda. So we have a frank situation here where people feel that they have been marginalized. Yes. Not only feel, but actually that is the experience they live.
Yes, it is very true. The issue of marginalization, especially in the north, has been prevalent in Nigeria for so long. But furthermore, I think, what my colleague said about, the local governance that is really inadequate. But furthermore, underscoring all this is the lack of economic development and opportunities for those who are either joining Boko Haram or people who are still in the region trying to survive. Since the insurgency started in 2007, we have over 600,000 people living as IDPs, or I would dare call them refugees, in our own country. And that is unacceptable. Where is the welfare and the protection of the human security of citizenry? That is not happening. We also have the issue of making sure that, when people are, even if they're on the local police force, if there are charges that have been claimed on somebody to say, this person has committed this crime, there is no judicial process whereby there is open prosecution of people who have been doing this. So imagine being on the armed forces where your fellow brother or sister is probably Boko Haram, but there's no consequence in their behavior. I would be demoralized. And also, it seems like the military forces in Nigeria have become politicized. It's either you are for the one party or you're for one person, but your first and foremost responsibility is to the people of the region.
Laura, I know that you are a Nigerian, and therefore I'm not about to question, frankly, the legitimacy of your credentials, but I also know that you come from Lagos.
Yes.
You come from the south.
Yes, I do.
So what motivates you to do what you're doing?
I'm a Nigerian. And that's it. I'm a human being.
But what about some people who say in Nigeria there are no Nigerians? There are Yorubas, there are Hausas, there are Igbos, and what have you?
I think that sentiment and that rhetoric is exactly why Nigeria is where it is today. There are a lot of people who benefit from the separation and the tribalism that continues, or the religious issues that the tensions that we face, whether are we majority Christian or, the North being primarily Muslim. The people who push that agenda are really why a lot of the fragmentation we see around the country exists. I think that the younger generation, people in my age range, between the millennia and Gen Y, we're not interested in that train of thought anymore. That was the older generation. We are interested in seeing Nigeria thrive. We're seeing our Nigerians, our fellow Nigerians, being uplifted where, the economic disparity of wealth and those who don't, which is predominantly the rest of the people, is pretty much reduced. We're looking to see that the youth have employment because they are prey basically for insurgents that are looking to recruit people who feel disenfranchised or marginalized.
Just suppose Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan were sitting in that very beautiful Paris of Aso Rock and watching Straight Talk Africa, and you have an opportunity to talk to him. Could you please look in the camera, and if you did, what would you say to him?
I would ask him, I would say to President Jonathan that you have a great opportunity here. You have an opportunity to lead the country because, as president, you have assumed responsibilities that you swore an oath to. The first and foremost is to protect all citizens of Nigeria. And that means you have to, first of all, deal with the issue of human rights abuses. you show good faith to your people, because, you know, right now a lot of people feel that the social contract between them and their government is broken. Persecute those individuals that Amnesty International and other human rights groups have documented committing human rights violations. You also need to do a lot to help with opening humanitarian resources, engage civil society to bring and to support your efforts in trying to deal with the issue. We have to talk about education for girls and for women, because women play a role in making sure economic governments function well. And if you neglect the attack that seems to be happening against the girl child and women across the country, then we have no hope of a great Nigeria that we all want.
Very interesting. Tom, let's go to the other part of Africa. We're talking about Kenya. What do you think about what is happening in Kenya and about what, in fact, the government is doing to protect its citizens against Al-Shabaab?
Well, I think Kenya, like many countries in the region, especially in that area of Africa, are confronting some of the fallout of this ongoing conflict in Somalia that I think we should all remember goes back decades. And is a consequence of successive failures to deal with that conflict in an effective way, and in a way that fundamentally transforms the conflict and enables real recovery and real peace building. And from the perspective of the Kenyans, they're in a very difficult place. They're trying to treat the symptom of the disease, while at the same time the disease is raging sort of unabated across the border. And I think the Kenyans are coming to understand something we talked about with respect to Nigeria, the criticality of police and justice systems, the fact that community-based security and collaboration with community members is essential to dealing with this kind of violence. And I think the Kenyans are struggling to resist the temptation to respond with force as the only option. This isn't a problem that is really amenable to a military solution. That's kind of a cliche. It's a cliche because it's true. A lot of criticism of the Kenyans in how they have addressed the consequences of these attacks. But I would have to say, I think the Kenyans recognize the need for fundamental reform within their police and justice system. They're really trying to undertake that. They have been for some years. It's a learning process. I think, and this relates back to how you deal with Shabab and with the consequences of Shabab attacks.
But what about the role played by the Kenya Defense Forces in Somalia as part of the African Union group AMISOM, which of course is also supported by the United Nations? There are a lot of people who are actually saying they shouldn't be there. Before 2011, they didn't have a lot of problems with Al-Shabaab.
And my argument would be that if you talk to people who have lived in that part of the sub-region, they've always had problems that go back to the conflict within Somalia, that go back decades.
Yeah, the shifters
and AMISOM is one of the great success stories on the continent right now. AMISOM is an example of African states and African institutions that are on the front line for solving African problems. It is African lives that are being lost in courageous military and police units that are trying, however imperfectly, to stop the fighting, stop the violence against civilians, and provide a genuine opportunity for recovery. But the points I would make is that Somalia, like Nigeria, is not only a military problem. It is a problem of governance. It is a problem of community-based security, a problem of community justice, and a problem of development.
What if I told you that, in fact, AMISOM is African boots on the ground with Western money?
I wouldn't argue with that. I would say, however, it's not all Western money. And I would emphasize that those African states that are contributing to AMISOM are making a significant contribution in addition to blood of their own treasure and their own resources. Now, certainly, they could not do so effectively without the support they are receiving from the international community. I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that rather as a a feature of the new global system,
But
as the international community understands that we all have a stake in resolving those problems.
But some of these countries, frankly, are places, for example, where leaders, or you may want to call them rulers, send their soldiers, their armies, without any consultation with their own people, with their own governmental institutions. It's like a personal thing.
And my observation would be, I think that situation is changing. It's changing across Africa. It's changing more quickly in some countries than others.
Yes.
Not changing as quickly as I think many of us would like it to, but it is moving in a positive direction. And I would also say, those countries that lack that kind of consultation, that lack that element of participative government, will ultimately confront serious problems in sustaining long-term efforts that require the commitment, the blood, and the treasure of their citizens.
Like perhaps we saw in Burkina Faso?
I would, you know, we talked about the impact of mobile technology and cell phones in Africa, and this, I think, is relevant to Burkina Faso. What we're seeing is the impact of a rapidly accelerating and changing environment in Africa, where people know what is going on in their countries and have opportunities to make their voices heard in constructive ways.
I hear you. You are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of a discussion in a moment. But first, here is Mariama Jaro. Take it away, Mariama.
Well, thanks, Shaka. Still to come, we'll reveal some of the feedback we've received from you through social media. And a reminder that you can participate in this conversation by posting on our Facebook page or tweeting using the hashtag #VOACombatTerror, or simply by emailing us. We'll be glad to share some of it in this program. Meanwhile, here is our letter of the week. Angam Alfred from Kampala in Uganda writes, religious beliefs are so much entrenched around the world that groups see one another as enemies in the fight for ideological supremacy. Africans must work toward creating a strong platform where all religious affiliations sit down and discuss their differences for the sake of humanity and the value of life.
Like Voice of America on Facebook. Follow VOA on Twitter. Join VOA on our YouTube channel. Like, follow, join VOA.
This is Straight Talk Africa on the Voice of America. Call us now with your questions and comments. The number 202-619-3111. And the U.S. country code is 1. Call direct and we'll call you right back. Remember to keep your questions brief. Now back to Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gizu, and welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. Once again, it's time to bring in my colleague and social media reporter, Mariama. Take it away again, Mariama.
Well, thanks, Shaka. In recent years, Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab have been blamed for destroying communities, robbing some young people of their futures, and restricting economic growth. African governments, along with their partners like the United States, have placed a high priority on protecting citizens from attacks by terrorists. Well, this leads us to our question of the week, asking, how can African governments effectively combat radical terror groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram? Well, let's begin with a comment from Emeka Anikwo from Nigeria, who writes, these groups usually have something to do or are attached to certain religious groups. The elite and top politicians from such religious groups, especially those in opposition parties, should openly and privately condemn and discourage these insurgents. This is not happening in my country, Nigeria. Well, Shaka, what do you make of this comment?
Very interesting How do you respond to that, Rhoda?
I think that, you know, I think it was Emeka was right. You know, there are people, at the end of the day, someone's benefiting, or many people are benefiting from the destabilization or the existence of Boko Haram. And unfortunately, right now we have an election coming up in February. So who does it benefit to keep the regions destabilized? Who does it benefit to continuously having you know, attacks every other day where people are afraid? You know, does that mean that people in the north will not participate in the elections? Is that part of what will happen? At the end of the day, that's part of it. It's making it, but at the same time, we have to, as a country, start moving beyond Muslim, Christian, North, East, South. We have to recognize that we are one sovereign territory. And as such, we need to support each other. People in the South need to recognize that what's going on in the North affects us. It affects our opportunities for partnerships, global partnerships. It affects our opportunity with our big export oil, for example, in the Niger Delta region that has been destabilized for a while. We're seeing the impact of a whole lot of things that is called globalization affect our country's revenue. So at the end of the day, we need to move beyond the old rhetoric of it's Muslim, it's, you know, and our leaders have to do the same thing. They have to keep condemning it. It is inexcusable that President Jonathan or any of the senators or other state governors are not more vocal on the issues related to the human security in the North. And it's not just on the federal level, it has to be on the local level as well.
You know, there was once a great man who lived on this land, and his name was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Among other things, he once said, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere.
And I agree with
How
that.
come people don't want to learn from that?
I just think that, unfortunately, first of all, there's so much going on in the world. I mean, even take D.C., whether it's Ferguson, or, you know, there's so much going on when it comes to human life that I think people's initial reactions, and I do too on sometimes, is I need to desensitize myself a little bit. Otherwise, my heart, my brain does not have the capacity to keep dealing with the constant negative news. So a lot of it is self-preservation. I think that people need to just kind of tune things down. But at the same time, we cannot fall asleep at the wheel. We have for so long, and it's time for us to get back up, to be engaged, and to participate in the transformation of our countries.
With a false sense of security.
Yeah.
Mariama, do you have any more feedback to share with our audience, please?
Yes, indeed, Shaka. Let's move on to a posting from David Chile. In Lusaka, Zambia, he writes, no law, no talks, no force will eradicate terrorism. Radicals will always be there because what we think are solutions is simply fun for them and stirs up their fire. For example, Americans thought arming Syrian rebels was a solution. Today, they are fighting the same people they armed. Shaka and guests, your thought on this one?
Interesting. Tom, your reaction?
Well, I actually think that these two comments are both related. One of the challenges across Africa is moving from the gun to the ballot box in politics and in political culture. I remember when I was in Liberia and Sierra Leone back in the 90s, the time was political elections were a time to call your young men out into the street with their clubs and their machetes and go after the opposition. And
from the bullet to the ballot.
From the bullet to the ballot. The continent's moving in that direction. Nigeria is moving in that direction. It wasn't that long ago Nigeria was a military dictatorship.
Well,
but it's a long process.
They have the distinction of having held the only free and fair election back in 1993.
Exactly.
That was annulled.
Yes. So in the process of moving to a new place where people accept that politics is through dialogue, through the ballot box, it's a long process, and it's difficult, and it's sometimes painful. And it's easy to lose track of where you're going while you're trying to deal with the Boko Harams and the Shababs and the political conflict in the streets.
I have to agree with Tom because civic participation is important. It is not military response that is going to change things. It is civic participation, creating avenues for people to be able to voice their concerns, whether it's related to governance on the federal, local, or state level. It's that kind of opportunities for individuals and citizens to feel that they are part of the change of their country that will transform things because they become informed, they become educated, and they become empowered.
That in
Amen,
fact
sister.
they are the primary stakeholders.
They own the country.
They employ the president.
Correct.
The chief justice, the
Correct.
cabinet.
And in fact, I was reading the Nigerian constitution the other day. The citizens of Nigeria own Nigeria. It is not one political party. It is not the military. It is not one individual or an elite group of people that own Nigeria. It is the majority citizens of Nigeria that own Nigeria. And hence, we need to call into account those individuals who are governing us, who are not abiding by the Constitution, who are not doing their best to promote health and well-being of the people that live in Nigeria, and are really negligent in providing human security or the necessary resources for us to be safe in our countries.
Definitely you need to you need a paradigm shift of sorts.
Yes.
Thanks, Mariama, for bringing us this week's audience reaction.
Well, thank you. And obviously, a vibrant civil society is always, always a big part of plays a huge part in any democracy. Well, that does it for us for today's social media segment. Just a reminder that we appreciate all the feedback, whether it's in social media form or using other means to communicate to us. Please, please keep them coming. And if you are a new fan, just drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com. Once again, our email address is africatv@voanews.com. Or post your comment on our Facebook page. Just enter the keywords Straight Talk Africa. Be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com, or you can join our YouTube channel. Simply subscribe to VOA TV to Africa. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Now, let's take a look at what's on tap for next week's program. Next week on Straight Talk Africa, term limits and constitutional reforms. Burkina Faso's ousted President Blaise Compaoré recently attempted to amend the constitution to extend his 27-year term, sparking an uprising. Now there is a talk of several other entrenched African leaders amending constitutions to remain in power. That's next week, right here on Straight Talk Africa.
Welcome back, and today we are discussing the war on terror and the ongoing battles against two major terrorist groups in Africa. Our distinguished guests are Laura Adele Oso, co-founder of Act for Accountability, a Nigerian-American advocacy group based here in Washington, D.C. Since April, her organization rallied 300 people outside the Embassy of Nigeria to pressure idle government officials to take measurable actions to save 276 schoolgirls kidnapped by Boko Haram militants in the northeastern Nigerian village of Chibok. And retired U.S. Army Colonel Thomas Dempsey, who currently serves as the Africa Center for Strategic Studies Chair for Security Studies. Professor Dempsey specializes in security sector reform, rule of law, post-conflict transitions, and peace and operations. I have to say, Rhoda and Tom, that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you for the first time on Straight Talk Africa.
Likewise, thank you.
My pleasure.
You're most welcome, ladies and gentlemen. A reminder that you are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. If you wish to participate in our discussion, please call us at 202-619-3111. US country code is 1. We'll continue our discussion in a moment, so please don't go away. Let me come to you, Tom. We talk about how the ordinary person really should be the primary stakeholder. How do you change these mindsets, these attitudes? Because the ordinary folk actually thinks, in a sense, is like a sharecropper.
Well, I think that change is happening in two ways today that I think are remarkable. The first we've already talked about, the spread of cell phones and mobile technology, making people more aware of what's going on around them and giving them a voice in ways that they've never had before. Mm-hmm. The second way is in something called decentralization that is appearing more and more across the continent. I think the best example of this is Niger, which was confronting 15 years ago many of the same problems that we've seen in Mali. And the response in 2001 was to scrap the old French-based system of prefectures and replace it with locally elected leaders.
Yes.
Mayors in towns and villages.
Yes.
And accompanying that political empowerment was a program to push development resources down and put them in the hands of those newly elected leaders, so that they not only had responsibility for decision making, but they had tools to actually implement those decisions. And I think if you look at Niger today, that reform has had a profound impact at every level. I think it's one of the main reasons that Niger hasn't gone the way that Mali has gone.
But you know what President Tanja nearly tried to do in Niger? He basically tried to shift the political constitutional goalposts. He basically decided not to worry about the Supreme Court. He was the man until his own military at one time woke up and surrounded the palace.
Which I think is another example of how difficult this process of change is. It is halting, it is slow, but it's moving in a positive direction. And I think, once again, the challenge is to remember where we're going as we negotiate the swamp and the alligators and crocodiles are trying to eat us.
Very, very interesting, very interesting.
Can I add something to
that?
Yes,
please.
I would say that quite often people don't leverage the youth in changing mindsets. That's the hardest part to do, because when culture is that, we've seen the image of the iceberg, it's all that stuff underneath the water that we don't really know about, that we've been brought up to, we've been socialized into behavior. But the truth is, come in 2020 or beyond, majority of Africa is going to be the people between the ages of 25.
True.
And there's gross unemployment when it comes to the youth. People who are in vulnerable situations in Africa, it's all as high as 75% unemployment rate.
Those changing demographics.
Exactly. Yes. The demographic is changing, and I think a lot of African countries are not taking advantage of the fact that educating that group of people, educating the future, means that change will happen.
People who own nothing.
Exactly.
They are not on the table, they are not eating.
Exactly.
And they want to eat. And you know what happens when you are between the ages of 17 and 30? You think you are invincible. Even if somebody tries to shoot at you, you keep advancing. Well, a reminder that you are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. If you wish to participate in our discussion, please call us at 202-619-3111. This country code is 1. We'll continue our discussion in a moment, so please don't go away.
Boko Haram was created in 2002 by Mohammed Yusuf, a cleric whose aim is an Islamic state in Nigeria. In Hausa, Boko Haram loosely means Western education is sinful. The group opposes the education of girls and has kidnapped some to use as cooks and sex slaves. The group's current leader, Abubakar Shekau, emerges sporadically in videotaped messages. Its home base is Nigeria's northeastern forest region, and the group is estimated to have up to a few thousand fighters. Al-Shabaab is responsible for more than 4,000 deaths in 2014.
We are able to touch on things that are important to people on an everyday basis. We hope that our viewers are getting inspired when they watch our show. They're getting a view of the world from a different perspective, things that perhaps are not in their immediate vicinity. Today, I could put in on the show something that is a little different, a little unique, and this gives me that inspiration to come to work.
If you like today's show, please write and tell us what you think or give us some suggestions. Be sure to tell us what station you're tuned into. Our address, Straight Talk Africa, Voice of America, 330 Independence Avenue Southwest, Washington, D.C. 20237 USA. Or send us an email at africatv@voanews.com. log on to our website at voaafrica.com or post your comments on Facebook. Keywords Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gidhui. Let me come to you again, Tom. Let's go back to East Africa. Go to Kenya in particular. You have a situation right now where Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, his case at the ICC at The Hague has actually been dropped in court because, in fact, they said that if they are able to access more evidence, they may, in fact, recall it back. In other words, he is not really acquitted. But what does that say about the victims, really, in Kenya?
Well, I on the one hand, I have to say that I think the process has, for the most part, been favorable in broad terms. I think it strengthens rule of law. It challenges the position that heads of state exercise impunity. I think that is a healthy thing. I think this goes back to the indictment of Pinochet in Spain. But at the same time, it also demonstrates clearly that if you don't have the evidence to support your case, then the case shouldn't move forward.
Yeah, but the ICC is on record saying it's not because the evidence is not there, but the Kenyan government, in fact, has, in a way, stonewalled. It has refused to provide the evidence that The Hague needs because they invoke the clause of national security interest.
And ultimately, I would add that justice needs to be local and national, and that it is the responsibility of every state to police itself, to establish and observe rule of law, and that to the extent that that happens, it benefits everyone, not simply in that state, but in neighboring states and in the international system as a whole. One of the things that's changing is the growing understanding of what I just said. Everybody's starting to realize at the individual level up to the national and international level
I have a stake in this thing.
that I have a stake in this system and that all of us benefit when the system functions in the way that it's supposed to. Now, the challenge for the Kenyans is reaching out to those communities in which the violence is centered and establishing relationships that will make those communities part of the solution and not part of the problem.
What about a situation where you also know that some of the witnesses were compromised either through intimidation or through bribery?
And unfortunately, corruption is a big issue. You know, how do you tackle corruption? Well, I think it's not a one-brush stroke solution. It has to be chipped away slowly by slowly. You have to have one, education of the people on what is the rule of law in the land.
Absolutely.
They have to understand what is the responsibility of local government, state government, federal government. What is their responsibility as a citizenry? But also, there has to be the promise that a judicial system will stand on its own. If there is no place for people to go to be able to call into account or ask for accountability, push for transparency, but furthermore, it's an inclusive system where they can be part of it, then, again, change will not happen.
Well, let's go to the lifeline of the show, which are the telephone callers. Good evening, Victor from Nigeria. You're most welcome to Straight Talk Africa. Victor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, what is your question, sir?
Yeah, we have been seeing uprisings from various countries like Iraq, Kenya, and Nigeria, which we have the Boko Haram. What is the opinion do you have to give to the government or these countries to curb the insurgencies that are happening in all these places?
Thank you very much. Would you like to try it, Tom?
Well, I think the first message would be to my colleagues in the Nigerian military who are fighting, who are leading soldiers in this struggle right now. And my message is, when you are leading your soldiers into these, when we are leading our soldiers into these difficult environments, mistakes are going to be made. Things are going to happen that shouldn't happen.
Right.
We must hold our soldiers and ourselves accountable when those things happen. We must be transparent about them, because people are going to know that the cell phones that we talked about, the videos, they don't happen in secrecy. And if we are not forthcoming, if we do not make an effort to hold ourselves accountable for our actions, we will lose the trust of the people that we serve.
They should operate as an officer and a gentleman.
As a servant of the people.
That is correct. Let me go to Tanzania, in fact, to East Africa. Good evening, Dr. Tumaini. You're most welcome to Straight Talk Africa. Dr. Tumaini, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Do you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. My comment was about Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. You know, the problem of solution they're trying to get out of what's going on, they go straight away to fight Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, but they forget the root cause of the problem. What was the good cause of these people to riot? Or what was the good people for these people trying to do what they're doing? Mediation could be the best solution, but at the moment they have to look about the gap. There's a big gap between poor people and rich people in those countries, but they don't think much about also the economic factor. They don't think much about the health issues between those people. When you see violence anywhere, that means people, they are tired, and now they are trying to get what they want through doing what they are doing. People can get anywhere because there's a gap, there's an idle mind. So we are trying to put it there.
Unfortunately, Dr. Tumaini, unfortunately, time happens not to be our best ally. But thank you so much. Thank you. So you have an election. You were talking about how the conditions may be favorable to someone and against someone. So who do these conditions currently favor? The incumbent?
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily the incumbents. I would say it's the elites.
The elites.
The elites that seem to have a lot of tentacles in different levels of government, whether it's in state government, in the House of Assembly, or elsewhere, or the political parties. And I would say that, you know, those are the people that seem to be moving the chess pieces across the board. And unfortunately, it's not always with good intentions. I think, though, that right now it is an opportunity for us as a country to make sure that, one, people are informed about where individual candidates stand on certain issues and push for that. We have to push for something, for them to be able to sign something or to declare their intentions for the country, and that is what we use to hold them accountable if they get elected in any form of government. Well, thank you so much. On that note, thanks to our distinguished guests, Laura Adele Oso, co-founder of Actor for Accountability, a Nigerian American advocacy group based here in Washington, D.C., and retired U.S. Army Colonel Thompson Dempsey, who currently serves as the Africa Center for Strategic Studies Chair for Security Studies. Thanks to our affiliate stations, along with our viewers and listeners, we thank you for tuning in. For many of our Voice of America radio affiliates, Learning English is coming up next, and tomorrow morning is Daybreak Africa with James Bate. On behalf of the Voice of America, thanks for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter, please. And remember to keep the African hopes alive.